I filed the expulsion notice myself. That is the part people tend to forget when they tell the story of what happened to the Rethkai Compact. They remember the collapse. They remember the trading partners who quietly stopped presenting compact credentials and began presenting ours instead. They remember the 11 years of silence from the human delegation and the slow, bloodless implosion of the only institution in the reach that had ever believed trade law was a weapon you could aim in only one direction. They remember all of that. They remember it because the collapse was visible, eventually, in the way that all large collapses become visible once the structure is already hollow. In the way you can see a building has fallen only after the dust settles, and you are left looking at the outline of what was there before. They do not remember the paperwork. They do not think about who filled it out. I was the one who filled it out. I was Marin Solis, third-tier clerk of the Rethkai Compact's registry chamber, and I was 26 years old and approximately 72 hours into a posting I had not wanted, on a station I had not chosen, working for a body I had been told represented the pinnacle of interstellar commercial civilization. I had a desk in the record-keeping tier, which was a long, horizontal gallery built into the chamber's interior wall about 8 meters above the main floor. From up there, you could see everything that happened on the floor and at the dais. You could hear almost nothing, which was by design. The compact did not want its clerks listening to deliberations, only recording outcomes. We received the formal motions by pneumatic document tube, filled out the registry forms in triplicate, stamped them with the chamber seal, and fed the originals back down the tube to the floor. The day Earth was expelled from the Rethkai Compact, I received the motion by tube at 11 minutes past the second rest bell, stamped it, and fed it back down in under 4 minutes. I remember that because I was proud of the time. 4 minutes was fast for a credential strike motion. Those forms had 17 fields. The Compact's senior registrar, a Vaughn named Orell who had held the post for 31 years and communicated with his clerks almost exclusively through a system of red and green indicator lights above our stations, lit up my green light twice in quick succession that afternoon. For him, that was effusive. I did not know, when I filed that form, what I had set in motion. Or rather, I knew exactly what I had set in motion on paper. On paper, I had struck the registered trading credentials of the human delegation and voided their membership in good standing with the compact. On paper, I had made it so that no compact-affiliated trade station, customs house, or exchange floor in the reach would be required to honor any human commercial instrument. On paper, I had done what the 7 dynasties had instructed me to do. That was the part I understood. What I did not understand, because I was 26 and new, and the compact had not considered it worth understanding, was the sealed document that a woman named Sarah Aldrich had placed on the registry table approximately 40 minutes before I received the motion by tube. She had placed it there. She had not said a word. The delegation had left. That is where I should begin. The Rethkai Compact was not a government. It was important to them that you understood this. A government, they would explain in the particular tone of someone correcting a naive child, has pretensions of sovereignty, of lawmaking, of the management of peoples. The compact made no such pretensions. The compact was a registry. It kept records. It certified credentials. It maintained, across 41 trade stations and 11 exchange floors, a single master list of who was in good standing and who was not. If you were on the list, every bank in the reach would extend you credit. Every customs house would honor your instruments. Every port would let you dock under standard commercial terms. If you were not on the list, you were, in the compact's preferred phrasing, unrecognized, which was a polite way of saying that the machinery of interstellar trade would not engage with you, and you were welcome to conduct your commerce in whatever dark corner of the outer systems you could find. This was, the 7 dynasties believed, the perfect form of power. It had no army. It required no war. It simply kept a list, and the list was everything, because the list was what every other institution in the Reach had agreed to trust. The Compact's authority rested entirely on consensus, but the consensus was 200 years old and so thoroughly baked into the commercial infrastructure of the Reach that no one had thought to question it in living memory. You did not fight the Compact. You did not argue with the Compact. You got on the list and you stayed on the list, and you thanked the relevant dynasty representatives at the appropriate seasonal gatherings, and you conducted your affairs. The Compact also believed, and I think this is crucial to understanding what happened, that the list was self-sustaining. Not merely that it had been accepted for 200 years, but that acceptance of it was now structural, so deeply woven into how commerce worked that the list could not be refused any more than you could refuse gravity. Every major bank in the Reach had been chartered under Compact credential standards. Every large exchange house had been certified under Compact protocols. Every customs procedure at every port of any significance had been written to reference Compact, standing as the baseline definition of legitimacy. The infrastructure of trust was the Compact. You could not separate one from the other. The dynasties knew this. They found it deeply satisfying. What they had never had to consider was whether the infrastructure of trust could be rebuilt. Not replaced. There was no arguing with 200 years of embedded procedure, and anyone who tried to argue with it would simply find themselves outside the machinery. But rebuilt, patiently, in the spaces the Compact had never bothered to reach, in the systems too small or too remote to have attracted dynasty attention, among the operators who had been conducting commerce under local arrangements and handshake agreements, and the kind of informal networks that develop when no central authority has thought to organize them. Humanity had been on the list for 31 years when the 7 dynasties decided to take them off. The specific cause, as with most Compact decisions, was a matter of procedure rather than principle. The dynasties did not issue declarations. They did not make speeches. They filed motions. The motion in question, which I would later spend considerable time studying, was filed by the Gorvith dynasty under the heading of credential review, and argued, in the bloodless language of registry law, that the human trading bloc had for the past 8 years conducted commerce in the outer systems through a series of subsidiary registrations that were technically compliant with Compact rules, but were, in the Gorvith filing's view, inconsistent with the spirit of full membership. The Gorvith motion requested a formal credential review. The credential review, once initiated, was conducted by a review panel appointed entirely from the remaining 6 dynasties. The review panel, after 11 weeks of deliberations that the human delegation was not formally permitted to attend, issued a finding of technical noncompliance. The finding triggered an automatic strike procedure under Article 47 of the Compact's Registry Code. The strike procedure was a vote of the full chamber. It was the tidiest piece of institutional machinery I had ever seen in operation. By the time the vote happened, the outcome was predetermined by 4 separate procedural steps, each of which was individually unobjectionable and collectively inescapable. The human delegation had been afforded every formal courtesy. They had received notice of each proceeding. They had been permitted to submit written responses, which had been received, acknowledged, logged, and set aside. They had been treated with complete procedural correctness at every stage. They had also been systematically and methodically expelled from the only commercial registry in the Reach, and the whole thing had been accomplished without the 7 dynasties ever having to state plainly what they wanted. What they wanted, as best I could determine from years of subsequent observation, was the outer systems. Specifically, the mineral extraction routes in what the Compact's charts called the Vethran Fringe, which humanity had been opening up through those subsidiary registrations the Gorvith dynasty found so procedurally distasteful. The fringe routes were enormously valuable. They were also outside the established lanes where the 7 dynasties had long since carved out their arrangements. The comfortable, well-mapped, generation-old trade corridors where every toll and tariff and preferred rate agreement had been settled so long ago that the dynasty representatives could conduct the relevant business in their sleep. The fringe was unsettled. The fringe was new. The fringe was where the next 200 years of commerce were going to be organized, and humanity had been in it for 6 years before the credential review was initiated. Moving quietly through systems the dynasties had never bothered to chart, building relay stations and waypoints and small extraction agreements with local operators who had never heard of the Rethkai Compact, because the Rethkai Compact had never cared enough to reach them. The dynasties had looked at the fringe maps and seen what humanity was building out there, and decided that the credential review mechanism existed for exactly this purpose. The machinery turned. The forms were filed. The vote was scheduled. I know all of this now. I knew none of it at the time. At the time, I knew only that there was a credential strike vote on the chamber floor at the second rest bell, and that I needed to have my 17-field form ready to go the moment the result came down the tube. The registry chamber itself was a long room. The Vaughn who designed it, 3 compact generations ago, had apparently believed that the appropriate architecture for commercial deliberation was the same as for a counting house, practical, unornamented, and slightly oppressive in the way that only truly functional spaces can be. The walls were pale stone, dressed and fitted so precisely that you could not see the joints without getting close. The floor was a darker stone, polished to a shine that always made me feel I was walking on the surface of still water when I crossed it. The dynasty representatives sat in a curved arrangement at the primary dais, which was elevated about a meter above the main floor, high enough to look down at petitioners, but not so high as to suggest theatrical grandeur, which the compact would have considered wasteful. Behind the dais, the 7 dynasty crests were inlaid in the stone in subdued metallic colors, not displayed exactly, simply present, as facts of record. The lighting in the chamber came from long horizontal fixtures set into the wall above the clerk's tier, above us, that is, which threw a flat, even illumination down onto the dais and the delegation floor without shadows or variation. The compact disliked shadows in its proceedings. Shadows were associated, in their institutional culture, with ambiguity, and ambiguity was, in their view, the enemy of a clean record. You could not have ambiguity on the registry. Everything needed to be clearly stated, clearly filed, clearly visible. The flat white light of the registry chamber was not an aesthetic choice. It was a philosophical one. The delegation floor was below and in front of the dais. This was where the parties to any proceeding sat, in chairs that were comfortable enough to signal that the compact respected your time and not so comfortable as to suggest that your business here was social. There were 2 tables on the delegation floor, one for each party in a bilateral proceeding. That day, only 1 table was in use. The human delegation sat at it. I could see them from the clerk's tier. There were 4 of them. I had spent enough time in the tier by then to have learned to read the compact's proceedings from above, to track the rhythm of a session by the body language of the participants, the pace at which documents moved between the dais and the floor, the temperature of the chamber in the way that only a room full of people negotiating can have a temperature. A contested credential verification ran warm, with frequent document exchanges and the particular body language of people who still believed the outcome could change. A routine registration ran cool but not cold, the rhythms of known procedure, nobody surprised. A sanction motion ran cold and quiet, the way a room goes quiet when the outcome is already known, but everyone is still required to be present for the formality. The human delegation was cold, not hostile cold. There is a difference. Hostile has an edge to it, a quality of attention that leans forward, that watches for the moment to object or counter. Cold is something else. Cold is what happens when someone has decided that the outcome of this room does not particularly matter to them, and has made their peace with that, and is now simply present as a formality while the machinery runs. I had seen cold before in the tier, in delegations that had already decided to appeal or to walk away, or to simply accept a bad result and recalculate. But those delegations cold had a quality of defeat to it, the specific stillness of people who have run out of moves and know it. This cold was different. This cold was chosen, deliberate, the cold of people who have somewhere else to be and have been mildly delayed getting there. The lead of the delegation sat closest to the dais. I learned his name afterward from the registry records I had helped create. Brevet Harlan, counsel at large for the Terran Commercial Coordination. He was a middle-aged man, neither imposing nor slight, with close-cut gray at his temples and the kind of face that had probably once been expressive and had settled, over years, into a controlled neutrality that was not blankness. There was too much going on behind it for blankness, but was something more deliberate than that. He had been attending compact proceedings for 7 years, according to the records. 7 years of credential renewals, of compliance filings, of written responses to review panels, of sitting in that chair while the machinery of the 7 dynasties processed him. 7 years, and he sat in the chair, now the way you sit in a chair in a waiting room, when you have been waiting long enough that you have stopped watching the door. Behind him sat 2 colleagues whose names I would eventually learn. A woman named Vasquez, who handled the technical filings, and a younger man named Arend, who I later found out was the delegation specialist in the subsidiary registration structure the Gorvith dynasty had found objectionable. Arend was the youngest person on the floor by some margin. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes fixed on the middle distance between the table and the dais, and his expression was the most neutral thing I had ever seen on a young person's face. Whatever he felt about what was happening, he had decided not to feel it in this room. And then, slightly to the side and slightly behind the main group, a 4th figure I did not at first register as part of the delegation at all. She was older than the others, considerably older, I thought, though Vaughn age is difficult to judge at a distance, and I was still learning the gradations. She was dressed in the standard diplomatic attire of a compact proceeding dark formal wear, the single credential band at the left wrist that signified recognized standing, but she carried a case. A hard-sided case, rectangular, about the size of a document folio but thicker, with a seal on the clasp that I could not read from 8 meters up. She set the case on the floor beside her chair when she sat down, and she did not look at the dais. She looked at the case. I noticed her because she was the only one of the 4 who looked at anything in the room with any apparent interest. Harlan watched the dais. Vasquez watched her own hands. Arend watched nothing. The older woman with the case watched the case. Not nervously, she did not fidget with the clasp, did not check the seal, did not touch it. She simply looked at it in the way you look at something whose importance you are holding in your mind, making sure you remember it is there. The Vaughn dockmaster, Aurel, opened the session in the prescribed manner. He read the motion number, the procedural history, and the formal finding. His voice was perfectly calibrated for the registry chamber, carrying without echoing, precise without warmth. Aurel had been in this chamber for 31 years. He had read more motions and findings than I will ever count. His voice had become, over those decades, almost indistinguishable from the chamber itself. A functional instrument, issuing the sounds the room required, entirely devoid of the inflections that would have suggested he found any of it remarkable. He could read a credential strike finding in the same register as a routine renewal. He could close a session that had taken 6 months to reach and announce the result with the same vocal weight he used to acknowledge the receipt of a filing fee. It was, in its way, a remarkable skill. It was the skill the Compact valued most in its senior staff. The dynasty representatives at the dais sat with the stillness of people who already knew the result and were simply waiting for the formality to resolve itself. The Gorvith representative, a long-necked Vaughn named Thesek who had been on the dais for as long as anyone could remember, held a stylus in one elongated hand and turned it end over end with the patient regularity of a metronome. The Pelrath representative had brought a secondary document to review during the reading, which was unusual, and which I noticed because it suggested she had not expected the reading to require her attention. The Mevrath representative, the young one, Sulian, who had only recently taken the seat, sat with both hands flat on the dais surface and watched the delegation floor with an expression I could not quite name from the tier. Not discomfort. Something older than discomfort, something that had moved past it. The reading of the finding took 14 minutes. It was a long finding. The review panel had been thorough. Every element of the subsidiary registration structure was addressed, cross-referenced to Article 47, and found wanting. It was the kind of document that had been written not to convince anyone. The outcome was not in question, but to be correct, to be on record, to be filed and sealed and retrievable for as long as the registry chamber stood. I had seen other findings in my short time in the tier, and I had already developed the skill of assessing them by density alone. How much text per point, how much cross-referencing, how many citations of historical precedent. A thin finding was one the panel had assembled quickly, confident in its ground. A dense finding was one the panel had assembled carefully, anticipating challenge. This finding was very dense. The panel had anticipated challenge from somewhere, even if the challenge could not change the outcome. Harlan watched Aurel throughout the reading. Not the stylus, not the dais in general, not the chamber around him, Aurel specifically, with the direct, undeflected attention of someone who had decided that if they were going to sit through this, they were going to sit through it with their eyes open. When the reading concluded, Aurel asked the formal question. Did the delegation of the Terran Commercial Coordination wish to offer a statement of record before the vote proceeded? The question was a courtesy. It was always asked. The answer was almost always no. A statement of record in a credential review proceeding carried no procedural weight whatsoever. The finding had been issued and the vote would proceed regardless. A statement was purely symbolic. The compact considered symbolism to be of limited commercial utility, and most parties to a credential review had learned this lesson by the time they reached the vote. Harlan looked at Aurel for a moment. Not long, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, just enough to make the pause register. Then he looked at the woman with the case. She stood, picked up the case, and walked to the registry table. This was a long stone table set to the left of the delegation area, used for the formal submission of documents to the clerk's record. Any document placed on the registry table during a proceeding was, under compact law, automatically incorporated into the record of that session. It was a rule so old and so procedurally embedded that it was treated as a mechanical fact rather than a legal provision. You put something on the table, it was in the record. That was how the table worked. Everyone in that chamber knew how the table worked. The rule was older than half the dynasties. It was not a rule anyone had ever had reason to abuse because there was no obvious advantage to filing a document in a credential review proceeding that you had no formal standing to file. The table accepted documents. The clerk logged them. They went into the record. And the record was kept in a sealed archive and retrieved only when a specific proceeding required reference to it. A document in a sealed archive was not nothing, but it was also not anything you could act on. She set the case on the table. She unlatched the clasp, opened the lid, removed a single sealed document. I could see from above that it was thick, the kind of binding that held a considerable number of pages, and placed it flat on the table. The seal on the document was not a compact seal. I could not read it from the tier, but I had spent enough time with compact seals to recognize the difference in design. Compact seals were round, dense with dynastic script, and carried a specific embossed edge. This seal was different, simpler in some ways, more elaborately specific in others. She closed the case, picked it up, returned to her chair, and sat down. No one on the delegation spoke. No one on the dais spoke. Thesek's stylus had stopped turning. Aurel said, in his usual register, as if this were entirely expected, The registry clerk will log the submitted document, which meant me. I made a note on my intake sheet, unknown document, registry table, session reference number, time logged, and waited for the tube to send me the intake form. It did not come immediately. Those intake forms were lower priority than vote result forms, and Orel ran a tight session. The tube delivered vote result forms first. That was the protocol. The vote proceeded. The 7 dynasty representatives voted in order of seniority. 6 voted to strike. 1 abstained, the Mevrath representative, Sulian, who was still watching the delegation floor with that expression I could not name. His abstention was technically meaningless. 6 votes was sufficient without him. But I noted it. It was unusual. The dynasties voted as blocks on credential matters. An abstention from Mevrath was the kind of thing that got discussed in certain circles afterward, the kind of procedural anomaly that suggested something was not quite as settled as the outcome implied. 6-0 with 1 abstention was sufficient for a credential strike under Article 47. The motion carried at 12 minutes past the second rest bell. I had my form in my hands before the vote total was announced. I knew how to read a chamber. The tube delivered the result and the motion language 30 seconds later. I filled out the 17 fields. I was fast. Orel lit the green light twice. Below me, on the delegation floor, the human delegation sat for exactly the time it took me to complete the form. Then Harlan stood. The others stood with him. They walked to the chamber door at the back of the floor in a single unhurried line, not quickly, not slowly, and they left. They did not say anything. Harlan did not look at the dais. He did not look at the 7 dynasty representatives. He did not look back at the registry table. He walked to the door with the particular quality of movement of someone who had somewhere else to be and had been mildly delayed getting there. The door closed. On the registry table, the sealed document sat exactly where the older woman had placed it. Orel looked at it for a moment. Then he directed one of the floor clerks to retrieve it, log it by seal and date, and transmit the intake form to my station, which was done, which I processed. The document seal, when I finally had the intake description in my hands, was registered to an entity I did not recognize, the Terran Commercial Coordination, which was the same entity the delegation represented, but the seal was not their compact credential seal. It was a different seal entirely, with a different design and a different registry number. A number I had to look up because it was not in any of our standard reference tables. The number was in a supplementary table, the kind that held credentials issued by recognized non-compact bodies, trading guilds, regional exchanges, minor certification authorities. The kind of credentials the compact acknowledged as valid for informational purposes, while not formally recognizing them as equivalent to compact standing. The issuing body, according to the supplementary table, was called the Harlan Registry. I noted that in the log. I filed the intake form. I did my job. I want to be careful here because I have been asked to tell this story many times, and there is a version of it that becomes too tidy in the telling. A version in which I recognized in that moment exactly what had been placed on that table and what it meant, and in which the drama of the session lives in some hidden prescience I possessed. I did not possess that. I was a clerk. I filed a form. I noticed that the issuing body's name matched the lead envoy's name, which struck me as odd, and I noted it, and then I went on to the next item in the session record. The understanding came later, over years actually, in pieces. The first piece came about 4 months after the expulsion, when I was processing a routine credential verification request from a trade station in the outer systems, a small station, Vethran Fringe Coordinates, one of the waypoint operations that human commercial operators had been building out there. The station was requesting verification that its commercial instruments were in good standing. Standard request. Except the instruments in question did not carry a Rethkai Compact credential number. They carried a Harlan registry number. I flagged it to Orel. He told me that instruments carrying non-compact credentials were not our responsibility to verify. If the station wanted compact verification, they needed to present compact credentials. If they were operating under other credentials, that was a matter for whoever issued those credentials. He was not curt about it. Orel was never curt. He was too disciplined for curtness, but he was final. The matter was settled by the protocol. The protocol was clear. I relayed this to the station. The station said, essentially, understood, and the request went away. 3 weeks later, a different station sent a similar request, also fringe coordinates, also Harlan registry credentials. I flagged it to Orel. He gave me the same answer. The request went away. Over the following 6 months, I received 11 such requests, all outer systems, all fringe or near-fringe coordinates, all Harlan registry credentials. Orel's answer was always the same, and his tone, through the indicator lights and the occasional written note that passed between our stations, was always the same. These are not our instruments, these are not our responsibility. If they want compact standing, they know the procedure. I kept a running list of the stations. I don't know why exactly. Something in the pattern bothered me. Not the requests themselves. Rejected credentials were not unusual. It was the geography. The requests were coming from a specific region, the fringe and its approaches, and they were all coming in under the same non-compact credential authority. And that authority had been established. I checked the supplementary table record again, approximately 11 years before the credential review vote. 11 years. While the human delegation had been attending compact proceedings, filing written responses to review panels, sitting in the delegation chairs on the floor of the registry chamber with the particular cold patience of people waiting for a formality to complete itself, this registry had been in operation, building, credentialing, quietly extending its reach into exactly the territory the 7 dynasties were trying to claim by expelling humanity from theirs. I did not tell Orel about the 11-year date. I filed my list in my personal records and went back to my work. The second piece came in my 3rd year on the posting. I was by then a second-tier clerk, which meant I had slightly more access to the inbound credential verification requests across the chamber's full intake, not just the ones routed to my station, but the aggregate volume. We tracked aggregate volume as an administrative metric, useful for staffing decisions. The numbers were mundane, and I reviewed them monthly in a 2-page summary that went to Orel and then into the administrative archive where, I suspected, it was never read again. The aggregate volume of requests citing Harlan registry credentials had, in my 2nd year, grown by a factor of 4 from the volume I had seen in my 1st year. In my 3rd year, it grew again, by roughly the same factor. This was not by itself alarming to the people who saw the numbers. The Compact's administrative culture was not built for alarm. It was built for process. Numbers came in, numbers were logged, patterns were noted, patterns that required action were referred upward, patterns that did not require action were filed. The growth in Harlan registry credential requests did not require action because Harlan registry credentials were not compact credentials and the Compact's protocol for handling them was clear. The numbers grew, the protocol handled them, they went into the log. Orel saw the numbers. His response, conveyed through a written note that arrived at my station on a quarterly basis for about 2 years, was always some variation of, send them the standard rejection language and log the intake, which I did. What I was looking at in those growing numbers was not something the Compact's administrative culture had a category for. The Compact's categories were compact credentialed and not compact credentialed, recognized and unrecognized, on the list and not on the list. The volume of not on the list requests was irrelevant because being not on the list was a fixed condition that the protocol addressed the same way every time. It did not matter whether one station in the fringe was asking or 100. The answer was the same. The protocol was the same. The numbers went up. The category stayed identical. except that the requests were not anymore, coming only from small operations. In my third year, I processed 3 requests from mid-sized exchange houses, established operations, not fringe outposts, the kind of mid-tier trading companies that had held compact credentials for a generation and whose names appeared routinely in the standard verification queue. The requests were unusual because they included both compact credentials and Harlan Registry credentials in the same packet, as if the submitting party considered verification of both to be normal steps in a single transaction. As if the 2 registries were parallel authorities of roughly equivalent standing, each worth confirming separately, in the way you might confirm both a banking reference and a trade guild certificate for the same counterparty. I flagged these to Orel. He was not pleased. He sent me a written note which was unusual. He preferred the lights, saying that the practice of dual credentialing was a known issue in the outer systems and that compact policy was clear. Compact credentials were the recognized standard, and if a party wished to additionally hold credentials from a regional authority, that was their prerogative, but the compact's verification process covered only compact credentials. He asked me to log the dual credential instances and send them to the policy desk. I logged them. I sent them. The policy desk, as best I could determine from the acknowledgement receipts, filed them. I kept a copy of the log for myself. I left the compact's employment in my 5th year on the posting. This was not a dramatic departure. My contract ended, I chose not to renew, and I took a position with a shipping coordination firm that operated primarily in the middle systems. The work was different, but the underlying discipline was the same: credentials, records, verification, the machinery of institutional trust that keeps commerce moving. I was good at it. I had always been good at it. The compact had trained me well in the fundamentals, which was perhaps the most ironic thing about my career. The institution that expelled humanity from its registry had spent 5 years teaching one of its clerks exactly how registries work and why they hold authority and what makes them vulnerable. What I was also good at, by that point, was reading a registry. The Harlan Registry was not hard to find if you were looking. It maintained a public index, accessible through any standard commercial network, and the index was organized along lines that would have been familiar to anyone who had spent 5 years in the Rethkai Compact's registry chamber. The structure was similar. The verification process was similar. The credential certificate language was similar enough, in fact, that I spent some time in my early months at the shipping firm wondering whether the compact had any grounds for a procedural complaint. I eventually concluded that the answer was no, because the Harlan Registry had been careful, in the way that the Terran Commercial Coordination had always been careful in its compact dealings, to be technically correct. The structure was similar because the structure was functional, not because it was copied. The language was similar because registry language has a grammar of its own, and anyone writing serious registry instruments would arrive at many of the same formulations through independent reasoning. The compact could look at the Harlan Registry and recognize the shape, but they could not point to anything taken. What they could see, if they were looking, was scale. The Harlan Registry, in its 7th year of public operation, 2 years after I had left the compact, was credentialing commercial operations across the entire Veteran Fringe, the approaches to the fringe, and a growing number of stations in what the compact's charts called the middle border. Systems that were compact adjacent, had compact affiliated operations, but had never been fully integrated into the compact's own registry structure because the dynasties had never bothered to pursue them. These were systems that had been conducting commerce for generations under a patchwork of local agreements, regional certificates, and the kind of informal trust networks that develop when no central authority has thought to organize them. The Harlan Registry had organized them. Not quickly, 11 years of quiet work before the credential strike vote, and 7 more years of consolidation afterward, but with the systematic patience of people who understood exactly what they were building and were content to let it grow at the pace a registry actually grows, which is not the pace of a war or a declaration but the pace of trust, which is slow and then suddenly not. The middle border stations had been presenting Harlan Registry credentials alongside compact credentials for some time by then. I had seen the early version of this in my aggregate volume logs in my third year at the compact. I had not understood then what I was seeing the beginning of. What I was seeing the beginning of was a question. Not an argument, not a challenge, not a confrontation, a question of the kind that emerges when a party holds credentials from two registries and the two registries' terms diverge. Which do you prefer? Whose rate is better? Whose dispute resolution is faster? Whose verification process takes 3 days versus 2? These were not ideological questions. They were commercial ones. And commercial questions, asked often enough across enough transactions, eventually produce answers, patterns, preferences, and preferences accumulated across enough parties and enough transactions become something that looks very much like institutional trust in a different institution. The third piece, the one that made everything else cohere, came through a contact I had maintained from my compact years. A Vaughn clerk named Death who had been on the tier with me and who had, unlike me, stayed on at the compact and worked his way up to a first-tier position in the policy desk. We were not close exactly, but we were the kind of colleagues who stay in loose correspondence, because they are the only people who understand each other's professional context, and because occasionally one of them has information the other finds useful. Death sent me a short message in my 9th year after leaving the compact. The message said that the policy desk had been receiving an escalating series of inquiries from compact-affiliated exchange houses in the middle border about the status of dual credentials, and that the volume had reached a level where it could no longer be managed as a logging exercise. He said that some exchange houses were not merely holding dual credentials, but were beginning to route transactions preferentially through Harlan Registry instruments when the Harlan rates were more favorable, and that this was happening not as an exception, but as a pattern. He said that the Mevrath dynasty, the one that had abstained on the credential strike vote all those years ago, had recently initiated an internal review of the compact's middle border relationships. He said the review was thorough, and that its conclusions, which he had seen a summary of, were not comfortable reading. He ended his message with a line that I think he intended as dry professional observation, and that I have thought about many times since. He said that the policy desk was spending a considerable amount of its time trying to determine when the Harlan Registry had become large enough to be significant, and finding it difficult to identify a precise moment, because it had grown so gradually and so consistently that there appeared to have been no single point of emergence. It had simply been present, and then more present, and then considerably more present. And by the time anyone at the policy desk had looked up from the compact's own administrative concerns to assess it directly, it had become the kind of thing that was difficult to address without acknowledging that it had been present for a very long time without anyone choosing to address it. Which I thought when I read that was exactly correct. That was exactly what had happened. The compact had been looking at its own registry, running its own procedures, managing its own archive. It had been processing the non-compact credential requests the same way every time and logging them in a file that was never the subject of any strategic review because the protocol was clear and the category was fixed. It had filed away the information about the Harlan Registry's growth the same way it filed everything, correctly, completely, and without ever asking what the accumulation meant. I wrote back to Death that I thought the difficulty was structural rather than informational, that the compact had built its 200-year authority on the premise that being on the list was binary, that you were recognized or you were not, and that the Harlan Registry had spent 18 years very carefully constructing a world in which that binary was false. A world in which you could be credentialed by two registries at once, in which the question was not whether you were recognized, but which recognition you preferred for a given transaction, in which the value of any registry was a function of what it could actually offer rather than simply the fact of its long existence. The Compact had no framework for this. The Compact's entire institutional identity was the list. To acknowledge that another list existed, and that parties were choosing between them, was to acknowledge something the Compact's machinery was not designed to process. Death replied that this was a useful framing, and that he was going to use it in his next internal report, which I thought was very like him. I want to tell you about the document, the one that Dr. Sarah Aldrich, Director of Registry Architecture for the Terran Commercial Coordination, as I eventually learned, had placed on the registry table during the credential strike session. I obtained a copy through legitimate channels years later when it was no longer sensitive. It was 412 pages long. It was, in the most precise possible sense, a registry document. It was the complete foundational charter of the Harlan Registry, including its credential structure, its verification protocols, its fee schedule, its dispute resolution framework, its governance provisions, and its list of founding signatories. The commercial operators, station masters, and trading houses that had agreed at the time of signing to recognize the Harlan Registry as their primary credential authority. The founding signatories included, at the time of filing, 147 commercial entities. All of them operated in the Veteran Fringe or its approaches. None of them held Compact credentials. They had been operating under local arrangements and informal agreements, the kind of patchwork that the Compact had never bothered to formalize because the Fringe was not, at the time, worth the administrative effort. The Terran Commercial Coordination had found them over 11 years and organized them, and offered them a registry that worked, that had clear standards and fair terms and a dispute resolution process that did not require you to first obtain Compact standing, which none of them had ever been offered, because no dynasty had ever thought to offer it to them. 147 at the time of filing. That had been 11 years before the credential strike vote. The document had been filed on the Compact's registry table during the credential strike session. Under Compact law, anything filed on the registry table was automatically incorporated into the session record. The session record was, under Compact law, a legal document of standing. The Harlan Registry Charter had been incorporated into a Compact legal document of standing. It had been filed correctly, in the precise moment when the Compact's machinery was engaged in striking Earth's credentials, and it had been filed by a woman who had spent years understanding registry law well enough to know exactly what the table rule meant and exactly when to use it. There was a note attached to the filing, a single line in the standard language of a registry submission, which read, "Submitted for record per standard procedure. No Compact action requested or required." No action requested or required. The document was not petitioning. It was not presenting a case. It was not asking for recognition which it would not have received or validation which it did not need. It was simply being filed. Under the same rule that had governed that table for as long as the registry chamber had stood, the rule so embedded in procedure that it had become mechanical fact, the rule everyone in that chamber knew without thinking about it. You put something on the table, it was in the record. The Compact had, in the session where it expelled Earth from its registry, formally incorporated into its own legal record the foundational charter of the registry that would spend the next 18 years replacing it. I was not present for what happened 11 years after the credential strike. I had been out of the Compact's employ for 6 years by then, and my information came from death, and from the public reporting that began to emerge once it was no longer possible to manage the situation through internal policy reviews. But I have read enough and spoken to enough people who were present to give you the shape of it. The Mevrath dynasty's internal review concluded, in the 11th year after the credential strike, that the Harlan Registry had achieved what they called functional equivalence in the middle border, meaning that, for purposes of commercial operations in that region, Harlan Registry credentials were being accepted on equal terms with compact credentials by a majority of the exchange houses and trade stations that mattered. This was not, Mevrath's review noted, because the Harlan Registry had done anything aggressive or confrontational. It had not attempted to invalidate compact credentials. It had not organized opposition, had not lobbied partner institutions, had not issued any public challenges to the compact's authority. It had simply been available, and it had offered good terms, and it had built trust through consistent verification and fair dispute resolution over years and years, until the trust was structural rather than provisional. The review concluded with a recommendation that the compact initiate direct engagement with the Terran Commercial Coordination to explore the possibility of mutual recognition between the two registries. The Gorvath dynasty blocked the engagement initiative. The motion to initiate engagement failed 4-3. 6 months later, two of the smaller dynasty houses, the Pelrath and the Surin, announced that they were independently entering into recognition discussions with the Harlan Registry, not the compact as a body, themselves as individual trading houses. Because they operated heavily in the middle border, and because the practical reality of their daily commercial operations had made the question of which registry to prefer into a question that had a clear answer, and they had decided to stop pretending otherwise. The Gorvath dynasty filed a procedural motion declaring the independent recognition discussions to be a violation of compact unity protocols. The argument was that individual dynasty houses could not unilaterally engage with non-compact credential authorities without full compact approval, that the unity of the registry was indivisible, and that the compact spoke with one voice on matters of credential recognition. The motion carried narrowly. The Pelrath and Surin continued their discussions anyway. I do not want to make this sound simple or fast or dramatic. It was none of those things. The compact did not collapse in a day. It collapsed in the way that institutions whose authority rests on consensus collapse when the consensus shifts gradually, then in large chunks, then all at once, and the large chunks in the all-at-once part happen only after so much of the gradual has accumulated that the institution is already hollow before anyone says the word. The dynasties argued for 3 more years. They passed procedural motions and counter-motions. They convened emergency reviews. They commissioned studies of the Harlan Registry's legal standing that arrived at varying conclusions depending on which dynasty had commissioned them. They sent delegations to outer system stations to reassert compact primacy. The stations were polite. They continued using Harlan Registry credentials for their fringe-adjacent operations. The thing that finally made it irreversible was not a battle or a declaration or a vote. It was the moment when the Aldrey Exchange, the largest independent exchange house in the Middle Systems, a compact credentialed institution for 130 years, announced that it would henceforth accept Harlan Registry credentials on equal terms with compact credentials for all transactions, without preference, without surcharge, without additional verification requirements. The Aldrey Exchange had 1,700 affiliate operations across the reach. Equal terms at the Aldrey Exchange meant equal terms in practice for a significant fraction of all commercial activity in the reach. When the Aldrey moved, others followed. Not immediately, but within weeks, and then within months, and then in a rolling pattern that the Compact's policy desk attempted to track and could not get ahead of because every time they drafted a response to one development, 3 more had occurred elsewhere. The Compact issued a formal objection to the Aldrey announcement. The Aldrey Exchange acknowledged the objection and maintained its policy. 2 weeks after the Aldrey announcement, the Mevrath dynasty began formally dual credentialing its own trading instruments. Sulian, the same Sulian who had abstained on the credential strike vote 11 years earlier, who was by now well established in his seat and no longer the youngest voice on the dais, issued a brief statement saying that Mevrath's decision was a commercial one, made in recognition of the operating realities of the Middle Border, and that Mevrath remained committed to the compact as an institution, while reserving its right to conduct its affairs in accordance with market conditions. 3 months after that, the Gorvith dynasty, the dynasty that had filed the credential review motion that started everything, sent a delegation to the Terran Commercial Coordination to inquire about the requirements for Harlan Registry membership. They were told that membership requirements were available in the public charter, the charter that was on file with the Rethkai Compact's own registry, incorporated into a session record from 11 years ago, submitted per standard procedure, no action requested or required. I heard secondhand that Orell retired that year, 31 years on the dais and then some years more. He had been in the chamber for every significant proceeding of his adult professional life, had managed the registry chamber with a precision and a dedication that, whatever I thought about the institution he served, I genuinely respected. He had run clean sessions. He had kept accurate records. He had been the kind of administrator that a registry needs in order to function, consistent, unambiguous, incorruptible in the small, daily ways that eventually add up to institutional integrity. He had done his job well for a very long time. And he had watched, had lit green lights for, had drafted written notes about, had convened policy desk meetings to address the systematic, glacial, absolutely inevitable dismantling of the institution he had served, without ever quite seeing it for what it was until it was already finished. Not because he was unintelligent, because his intelligence was shaped by the institution's categories, and the institution's categories had no bin for what was actually happening. The list was either everything or it was nothing, and the compact had never seriously entertained the possibility that someone could build a parallel list, because why would anyone do that if the list already existed and you were on it? And if you were not on it, you had no standing to build anything. That was the point of the list. Except that being taken off the list, it turned out, was not the same as being without standing. It was the same as being without standing inside the compact's framework. Outside the framework, in the systems the compact had never reached, and among the operators the compact had never bothered to credential, standing was a different thing entirely. Something you built through reliability and fair dealing and consistent presence over years, in the quiet, unhurried way that trust actually accumulates when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. I think about the credential strike session sometimes. I think about the 4 delegates sitting in those chairs in the particular cold of people who have somewhere else to be. I think about Harlan watching Orell throughout the reading of the finding, not the dais, not the chamber, Orell specifically, with the attention of someone who wanted to be certain he remembered this correctly. I think about Dr. Aldrich walking to the registry table with the case and setting down 412 pages of foundational work and saying nothing at all, and then picking up the case and returning to her seat with the same unhurried quality the whole delegation had, the same quality of mild delay, as if the session had been a brief interruption in a morning that had other things in it. No statement of record, nothing to argue about, nothing to object to, nothing to address. Just a document filed correctly in the only moment when it needed to be filed, under a rule so old and so embedded in the machinery that Orell had simply said, in his usual register, as if it were entirely expected. The registry clerk will log the submitted document. Which I did in under 4 minutes. The compact had wanted the fringe roots. They had used their institutional machinery to take them, in the way they had always taken things, through procedure, through the list, through the quiet certainty that the list was everything and they were the ones who kept it. The machinery had been tidy and procedurally correct and completely bloodless, and the human delegation had sat through all of it in the cold way they sat and then walked out, and the compact had looked at that walkout and seen what it expected to see. A party without recourse, leaving because there was nothing left to do. They had not asked what the delegation was going to do next. It had not occurred to them to ask. There was no next for a party without standing. The list was binary. Off the list you were nothing. What they had not understood, because the machinery was not built to understand it, was that the delegation had filed their next move on the registry table before they left. 11 years later, the compact asked to join humanity's list. I was the one who processed that inquiry too. I was working for the Terran Commercial Coordination by then, had been for several years, running the registry's verification desk for the middle systems. When the Gorvith inquiry came in, I recognized the credential seal immediately. The long-necked dynastic crest in subdued metallic colors, the dense circular script around the edge, the embossed border I had spent 5 years learning to stamp correctly. I had processed hundreds of documents bearing that seal. I had kept accurate records of all of them. I processed the Gorvith inquiry correctly. I sent them the public charter. The charter was 412 pages long. It was on file with the Rethkai Compact's own registry. It had been there for 18 years, exactly where Dr. Aldrich had placed it. That was my job. I had always been good at my job.